Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don and Chris joining you today as we're going to do a little exploration that is, I guess, recent history is a good way to describe this, Chris, although I just realized I'm looking at the dates here is not quite as recent as I want to believe it is in my head. I was a kid when this happened, and I'm not a kid anymore, I guess is going to be my point for this.
Not to make anybody, not to be ageist. I didn't exist.
I understand. I was about to go there, Chris. You weren't even alive when this happened. And so what we're going to be talking about today is an incident that happened in 1979. In fact, it was March of 1979, and it was the 3 Mile Island nuclear facility incident, 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. In fact, I remember as a kid, Chris, in 1980, my family took a vacation to where you live, the Washington, D.C. area. And it was a driving vacation, and that was actually during one of the oil blips crises kind of thing that was going on. In fact, it actually may have been, now that I think about it, it was in 79 that we took that trip. It wasn't 80 now that I think about that. It was the summer of 79, so not long after this event. And I remember that one of the things that happened is we were crossing back across Pennsylvania on the famed Pennsylvania Turnpike, and looked off to the right because we're heading from the east to the west, and we could see those very distinctive nuclear stack type things. And I remember looking on the map as an 11-year-old, because I was responsible at that point for being the map guidance person. That's a whole other story for a whole other time, about the time my mom was having us look for a hotel in the wrong state. And after that, the map responsibilities were handed over to me as a kid. But I remember looking at that and going, "What's that?" And I go, "Oh, that's 3 Mile Island." And I remember the expression on my parents' face. And of course, I'd remembered the event from March of that year. And the fact that we were that close to 3 Mile Island, I think my dad may have put a heavier foot on the accelerator. I'm just saying, I think that may have happened. But the 3 Mile Island event, probably definitely by far the most famous American nuclear power incident. We'll talk a little bit more. I know we'll talk about others as we move along here because we were talking about them off podcast. But the concept here today, Chris, is looking at a historical what if there had not been a 3 Mile Island event, and where would things be now with nuclear power? And the last thing I'll say here, and I'll let Chris get a word in edgewise here as I'm getting us set up, is here in Texas, where I live, this past week, we were actually asked by our electricity grid to conserve power as much as possible because the extreme heat that we're having here in the early part of the Texas summer was going to be putting a strain on the capacity of the grid. So we were asking to be good consumers and conserve because there was concern about demand exceeding capacity. And that's always a result of what do you have for capacity? And we have a mix of, here in the Texas grid, a unique grid that's not connected to any other grid in the United States. That's a whole other thing, not for this podcast, but for a whole other discussion. We have a number of sources. We have a nuclear power plant, the South Texas Project. We have gas-fired plants. There's still a few coal-fired plants. We have wind, solar. We have a number of different sources here, but the realization of we don't have as much power, obviously, just sitting around, or else the ERCOT would not have been asking us to conserve. And so I began to wonder, how would things be different if there had been a different course or trajectory for nuclear power here in the United States? And that caused me to think about 3 Mile Island. So this is the part where I shut up, Chris, and let you get a word in edgewise. Didn't even let you say hi to the good people.
Yeah, well, I will say both hi to the good people and a word edgewise.
There you go. So what do you remember, having not been born, Chris, but what do you remember from history and study and other things about 3 Mile Island? When I say that, what pops into your head?
Well, I need to look and see if we have any listeners in the Harrisburg, Pennsylvania area before I really get into my feelings on it. before I really started to dig and understand it, it was a partial meltdown, and I did not really get the difference between it and Chernobyl. When I started learning about these two things, they were the only two that had happened. This was before Fukushima, and they were both partial meltdowns. That's the extent of what I knew.
And there you go. And for me, I guess Chernobyl was in 85. Is that right? 80.
I want to say 86 because I think Gorbachev was already.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, Chernobyl is 86. So these are 7 years apart. And by the way, I didn't realize this until doing a little bit of research here. The International Nuclear, the INES, has a 7-level scale, with 1 being the least impactful, 7 being the most impactful. Chernobyl ranks a 7. It's a major accident, as it should, and you might well imagine. There's portions of the former Soviet Union that to this day are not inhabited and will not be inhabited for, let's just say, basically from all intents and purposes, forever. In terms of being able to be safely inhabited there. 3 Mile Island was a 5. So not a minor thing, but also not to the same level of Chernobyl. And the area of contamination, the release of the radioactive gas at 3 Mile Island versus what happened at Chernobyl, in terms of the size of the impact area, very, very, very different. But the point being there, anytime you're dealing with nuclear power and the risks associated with it, a little bit of problem goes a really, 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 really long way and lasts for a really, really, really long time. The curious thing when we were talking off podcast, I know, Chris, and sort of getting ready to record here, is we started looking into some of the statistics about nuclear power consumption around the world. And you threw a statistic at me. You asked me in the form of a question to take a guess, and I was shocked. Do they use any nuclear power in France, Chris?
Yes. France is, just to put because I already have the number, I'm going to say 75%. It was 74.5% of all of their power generation is nuclear.
And on the other end, or one of the other end of the scales, by the way, it's about 30% globally was the number that I came across here. And the United States has topped out at approximately 25-ish% of capacity of what's there. I'm looking at the chart that I sent over to you, Chris. Now I just got to get it open here. But as of 2022, we were just under 20%, about 18% of U.S. Electricity was being generated by nuclear. So big difference between 75 and let's call it 18%, even though there's a difference in terms of the geographic size of the two countries, difference in population of the two countries. It'd be a fair thing to say that France has embraced nuclear technology, and the United States, which went from a little bit over 5% in the early 1970s up to this number peaked at about 20% and is now down to about 18%, really remained unchanged from about 1985 on. So sort of two different trajectories or two different paths here.
The one thing I'd say, you're saying we were at 5% in a little bit around 1970-ish. That I think is largely because I want to say civilian nuclear power didn't exist until the 1960s. It was after we developed nuclear power for other purposes. And I think the big thing to think about, to keep in mind here is nuclear power is generated by a reaction, by setting off a nuclear bomb inside enough concrete with enough controls that it doesn't become uncontrolled.
Right.
That's what it is. you keep hearing about cold. We've discovered hot fusion. That's 1950. We've done that. Cold fusion or fusion as a power source is something that we've been working on for the past 70, 80 years, trying to figure out how to control it. Because if we can do it controlled, I mean, the byproduct's water.
Right. And no waste to figure out where you're going to stick it, that has to be, quarantined and put where it's put for literally millions of years to lose its potential negative impact to human beings. And so again, we're an alternate history podcast. So we've talked a little bit about the history of it here. So the concept we want to explore here as an alternate path is assuming that the 3 Mile Island incident in 79 is not an incident that receives the public notice and is a threat to safety without a release there. So the concept is, some of the things that failed, an open relief valve that caused this, they lost the appropriate amount of coolant for that led them to having the partial meltdown. What we're going to assume here as our point of departure is that they may have had some type of problem with the valve. Valves fail, things go wrong all the time, but that all the systems, backups, and alarms did what they're supposed to do in such a way that it wasn't an incident that caused them to need to shut down the plant for a period of time. They make the usual reports they're supposed to make to the various regulatory commissions. So those things get incorporated into safety guidelines and designs of future systems. And that what happens is there's no 3 Mile Island in our nation's energy history to be an impact there. And so that's going to be our simple point of departure. And having said that, as we were starting to do the research here because we were curious, it wasn't until 2012 that the next new construction of a nuclear power plant was approved. And Chris, you were the one who had some personal knowledge of this. It really was just new nuclear reactors at an existing site, right?
Right. You mentioned a little bit when we were talking. And this is something to think about when it comes to the French model, or why is France so into nuclear? You can only build nuclear by water. Nuclear needs a lot of fresh water to cool it. Right. So you can't really build it in the middle of some places. It just so happens that humans also need a lot of fresh water. So it just so happens that where you have cities, you happen to have that resource, I guess.
Right. Or in the case of the one facility that we have here in Texas was actually built along the Gulf Coast, where it had the benefit of river water. And then, in theory, there's salt water that can be, desalinized or something like that if you really absolutely had to at a pinch. But that's an excellent point. And so the thing that we wanted to discuss in this particular historical what would be different, right? And so one of the things that's there is we were on a pace or a course for nuclear obviously to become a bigger part of electrical generation. So I'm going to assume here, and it's, there's no good reason for this assumption, that we probably would have at least gotten up to the 30-40% range at the pace that we were going, maybe not embracing as much as France has or did, but that we were certainly on a track to have more, instead of just the stop that suddenly not until 2012 that there's even by the way, that was right after the Fukushima event in 2011. And so there was even some concern about doing that. So let's just say we end up with 40% of our power generation, Chris, let's say coming from nuclear, just to throw a number out there for our historical what if, about double what it is now. And that had grown, let's say, by let's just say 2000-ish period of time, 20 years, 25 years, but certainly you can see the path that's there. Would things be different if we had 20% of our electricity coming from that as a source versus where we get it today? I know you had some things you thought might have been impacted. What's the first thing that pops into your head?
The first place I went was this. But I'm a little surprised that your family took the road trip they did in the summer of 79. Were you cognizant at that age of what gas was?
Yes, and it was interesting. I remember that trip so well in a lot of ways. We had planned to do it, and I think they my mom and dad had some thoughts about maybe not taking it. But one of the things I remembered was during that summer, of course, as the gas shortage came along, rationing came into effect, and odd even rationing came into effect. And so here we were. One of the things that we had that broke in our favor in some of the states that were doing gas rationing that summer while we were on that trip was that out of state plates didn't fall under the odd even rationing rationale in terms of being able to get it. So we were at least able to get gas every day. And we had originally planned to go further up into New England during that trip. I say we made it. DC was on the itinerary. We turned around at DC to head back because of concern about getting further away from home on this driving vacation, and would we be able to get the gas to get back. And I can also remember Dad buying a gas can. This was not safe. We had a 1977 Mercury station wagon with like the wood paneling side. It's the family truckster from Vacation in a blue and wood version versus the green one that's there, if you want to think about it that way. And Dad knew this was unsafe and he was concerned about doing it, and it was part of my job being in the back there, but there was no trunk to put it in. And so we had a gas can that at least had a little bit in it just in case, because Dad was going to be cautious about that. So yeah, we to your point, I'm surprised we took that trip too, but we didn't take quite the trip we originally planned to take as a result of what was going on.
What was going on? I guess do you remember the first shock in 73?
I remember that as a very small child, the gas lines, I can remember, you just couldn't go and, fill up like you wanted to, kind of thing. So yes, I do remember that. And then remember the subsequent, 79, shortage and what was going on there. Similar sources, different sources, that were part of what was happening in terms of, they were geopolitical. It wasn't because there wasn't, oil to be brought out of the ground and gas to be produced. It was about where the supply was coming from, primarily in the Middle East.
So to touch on those two, 73 was the Yom Kippur War.
Right.
The United States and the West supported Israel. The Arab nations and the Soviet Union did not.
And so it was the embargo.
And they decided, and it kind of dawned on a lot of the Gulf Arab states specifically that we have this massive resource that we've just been handing out. And if we decide to stop doing that, maybe we'll become important. 79 is because of the Iranian Revolution.
Right.
And all through the 1980s, you have, and I was very clear when I talked about this as the first Persian Gulf War, because I've heard it referred to as the first Persian Gulf War. Not kind of my earlier memories of what happened in 91, but throughout the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, the United States Navy, along with other Western navies, was in an undeclared war in the Persian Gulf against Iran that was trying to disrupt oil shipments out of the Persian Gulf. Basically. I don't think that's that important because, when we talked a little bit, the United States, despite what most people would really think, the United States doesn't import a lot of oil. There are years I don't think it imports any. Thank you, Texas. Thank you, Alaska.
In terms of net imports,
right?
There's all coming in, but there's all going out.
Right. The United States has those domestic sources. Europe doesn't, and they are the ones that can really be, as we're seeing right now with the concern over their maintenance of the Russian sanctions. They're the ones that are really that are really sensitive to it. But it is a global market, like you said. And if we don't use it here, we have it to sell somewhere else. So specifically, if the United States is not using oil domestically to produce its power because it's scared of nuclear. That then becomes an export industry that we can use strategically to support friendly governments, as opposed to leaving them on the open market, paying whatever unfriendly, unstable governments want to charge them.
Yeah, and just to be clear, you made the reference there to oil, and oil is certainly burnt or consumed for electricity generation. It really is the entire energy complex that sort of gets wrapped up in this, where nuclear displaces some of the electricity generation in such a way that the fuels or the other sources can go towards other means without it being all tied together. And it's complicated that way, because I was in this industry or related to this industry for a good portion of my work career. And one of the things about electricity they talk about is your base load generation. And that's sort of what what is always on, because it's the hardest thing to start up and it's the hardest thing to shut down. And so nuclear tends to be one of the primary base loads where you have it for electricity, because you start the reactors and you don't stop the reactors. The nature of what they do means that they're there all along, and then you use other fuels to adjust for demand. Like, for example, here in Texas, we're now heavily dependent upon natural gas to be what picks up our peak demand now, because you can turn natural gas electricity generators on and off relatively quickly compared to nuclear. And nuclear is far more dependable than solar and wind energy, because the nuclear reactor works all the time. It's not waiting for the wind to blow or the sun to shine.
As long as it has power coming in.
Correct. And you're able to balance where the power is and where you need the power to be, which is a whole other thing.
Which, interestingly enough, now that I'm thinking about it, that's actually the problem in the other two nuclear incidents that really happened, Fukushima and Chernobyl, not 3 Mile Island. But that's also what led to, as I understood it, and correct me if I'm wrong, some of the problems a couple of winters ago with it's you need this is very counterintuitive. It takes energy to make energy.
Well, and the other thing I remember learning for the first time in the when I was in that business is, electricity doesn't always just flow the way you want to. Sometimes you have to actually flow electricity back in the direction opposite of where you're taking it to. And it's inefficient in the way that it flows across. It's not like a fluid in a pipeline that you just pump it to where you need to go. And so these, having stable baselines are an important part of this. And of course, we've gotten off into, the science, the technology, but where this is relevant back to what we're talking about, if you've got 40% of your electricity coming from nuclear, that's a very stable 40% that's across the board, that you rely upon it regardless of the season, regardless of the time, regardless of other things. It is your base load. Now, when you have peaks and demands because of summer cooling, winter heating, all of those things that can impact what's going on with that. Yeah, you do have to have capacity come online to meet the demand, but your baseline demand is being handled by this, by the way, very expensive and takes a long time to build technology.
Anybody that has played SimCity knows that. Yeah,
but once you have it, the relative cost over the life of the facility is economically feasible, and it's a little bit of fuel goes a long way. Ask a U.S. nuclear carrier out at sea how long they can go, because they're nuclear and they don't have to worry about stopping in at a port if they're actually in a fight in war, right? That's the whole point.
So that's actually a good tie-in back to what we were kind of talking about, is maybe we don't need to have so many of those nuclear carriers over in the Middle East if we are less dependent on that oil.
Right.
That goes through my mind. The other thing, once you get talking about the oil economy and a decrease in demand there, the other thing I talked about was right after this happens in the 1980s, the Soviet economy has kind of ground to a halt. It just isn't working. And they do have a lot of natural gas and a lot of oil, which is basically how they survive as long as they wound up surviving. They're able to, and as you mentioned yourself, Don, that extractive and export economy is what's allowed. When is this being released again?
Almost instantaneously. So we're recording the weekend of what we'll call the group Wagner Fund, or Group Wagner Fund in Russia.
So as of recording, he's still the president. Putin was able to export a lot of that gas, and he's used it up until recently. He used it very adroitly to both prop up his economy, and like I was talking about with the OPEC 73 embargo, he's been able to use it as an effective cudgel against nations that he wanted to cudgel.
Right.
If they don't have that kind of demand, i.e., the United States is able to, like I said, meet Europe's demands, maybe it's harder for the Soviet Union to survive. Maybe it doesn't survive as long as it did, or, it is good that we're recording it this weekend because, instability anywhere in that side of the world creates a lot of problems.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And the other thing that occurred to me is, I just thought about this because it's also been one of the things that's happened in the last 15 years, fracking and the ability to the natural gas being drowning, so to speak, in natural gas domestically in the United States, which has been the phenomena of the last 10 to 15 years in terms of supply for natural gas. But, one of the things that flipped there was up until the regulatory change, the U.S. had two facilities. One of them is not far from me. It's over at Sabine Pass, a company called, French company, by the way, called Cheniere, had a natural gas importation facility there. And it wasn't until the change in regulation and the law in the U.S., I guess that was in the late aughts, where they were allowed then to build natural gas liquefaction plants to export LNG, which is, that's been the big thing in the last 10 to 15 years. And part of the reason we were willing to do that is we had so much natural gas, we didn't feel like we needed to hold on to all of it for domestic needs. We had enough we could turn it into an exportable commodity and be okay with. I think if you go back and rewind, back to a different path for nuclear, not cut off or topped off because of the concerns following 3 Mile Island and on the heels of that Chernobyl, is that you have a scenario where we may have been more willing to become a natural gas exporter as a nation, meaning the United States, earlier. And so now, to your point, Chris, if there's more if we're building those facilities, which by the way take 5-6 years to build and to be able to do that and supply, you don't do this overnight. You don't turn on the ability to ship natural gas across the ocean that quickly like you can with a pipeline from the Soviet Union or from Russia. But if there's the ability,
according to him, those had all those problems. Those were constantly getting shut off.
Yeah, exactly. Is that you have the potential where maybe in the late 80s, certainly by the 90s, where Europe is going, we got to have natural gas. The United States, we got plenty of it.
and the United States is able to, in the same way that, today you hear about Saudi Arabia intentionally pumping gas to keep the price low to prevent that hard capital from going to Iran.
Right.
You could have the United States subsidizing and developing that natural gas to keep Europe coming to, like I said, this kind of places we want them coming to for these things.
Right. And, so, thinking through, again, the whole idea is what if no 3 Mile Island, is that, I think you have a different potential structure of an electricity generation market in the US. By the way, another way that this plays out, also tying back into the dependence upon oil to produce gasoline for transportation needs, is that if electricity is more plentiful, cheaper, or at least consistent in terms of its ability to be produced at a particular price, because a larger portion of the base load is nuclear, what happens maybe to an acceleration 10 to 15 years ahead of the curve of the electric car market, where suddenly you're looking and going, is this a better alternative because of what we have available here, all the things that are happening there? Maybe you have different governmental, a lot of what we know about that here in the US and globally as well, is a lot of it depends on what tax incentives governments are creating for the manufacturers of those vehicles to do what they're doing. But maybe you have a different mix in that, and suddenly, long before the Bond villain that we've referenced a number of times, Mr. Musk, comes along with Tesla, somebody else had already come along 15 years before with what was the coming electric car manufacturer in the US or globally.
I think that's a really interesting idea, just because what we had also discussed is that we're not sure if solar and wind in the United States become what they do because they are not seen as necessary. But I also feel like if I'm going to call it fixed generation capacity, if the side of the electric of the power world, more specifically, that comes out of that plug in your house is more eco-friendly, I think more of the research and more of the attention is paid to the part of the power universe that is mobile, your car.
Right.
So specifically battery technology. I think that's a place where, if we're not thinking about PV cells, if we're not thinking about other ways to try and keep what is the majority of the power generation universe cleaner, then we can actually pay attention there.
Right. And the other thing that the other thing we were talking about off podcast, we had a great off podcast conversation, because we haven't had one in a while because of the things that have been going on. But Chris and I were talking there just generally about geopolitics and the other things that have gone on with this. But if you imagine the scenario where there's, as you said, the later development of solar, or different thinking about how solar gets developed and how the technology gets developed around that, where you're less dependent upon oil as a general part of the mix here, maybe there's more electric cars that are going on, is all of the things around the politics that were the domestic politics part of the equation also maybe get changed a little bit. Is there as much of an inconvenient truth that Al Gore is having to tell us about? Is there a same boom in Texas in the 90s after the 80s oil crunch that sets up a George W. Bush to be in a position where he can, run for national office? You have all these other little things that may just be corollaries to a different what's going on in the power world, but a real part of what's going on in the power world.
Something else that's going through my mind right now that I find really interesting is you are now seeing, I'm going to say, Detroit getting into electric vehicles. What if electric vehicles become a thing, become both technologically feasible and what if that shift happens before deindustrialization? The deindustrialization of the Rust Belt happens in the mid-90s with the opening of China, with the increasing global trade. What if this whole energy economy, and you keep hearing people talk about, well, we can retool these old factories for this or for that. what if the factories are still open?
Right. They're just producing an electrically powered vehicle versus an internal combustion engine rolling off, for example, just using the auto industry as an example.
Right.
Or something I know that you know a thing or two about. One of the big things when natural gas was becoming as plentiful a resource as it started to become now over a decade ago, they were talking about primarily for trucks, for transportation, 18-wheelers, and trains, for example, that would be natural gas powered. What if you had some of the capabilities there? It's hard to imagine the electric semi truck, although I know I've read and heard things about that too, that theoretically we may be moving there in the battery technology. But if you had more of that sort of rippling through all of those economies in such a way that it changes. If you change the electricity mix, you change a lot, I guess, is the point. Without belaboring that point or beating it to death, is that it matters for a lot of different industries, as you're talking about, for a lot of different ways.
Right.
And one of the interesting things, again, because I was in things related to this industry, as the natural gas export has really started to fire up, a lot of the natural gas that's produced and that goes through the process of being liquefied in the United States are under 30, 40, 50-year contracts to the ultimate consumers here, because they have to have that in place to justify the economics of building the liquefaction plants, because they're incredibly expensive. And by the way, they're energy intense in the process of what they do there. That's a whole other part of what's there. They have to have a good source of energy to turn the energy into something that can be exported in the case of the natural gas. But for example, a lot of that natural gas is going to Asia for what? For electrical generation, being a good example there. And so, it's all part of the global economy that's impacted by what's happening or not happening. And again, nuclear makes a difference here, because we don't hear France, being one of the nations in the current Ukrainian war, worried about where their natural gas is going to come from. Why are they not worried about where their natural gas is going to come from?
Or they're less worried than
they're less worried. Yeah. Then, for example, a Germany, or certainly, a lot of Eastern Europe is in a very different scenario when it comes to that. You mentioned Chernobyl, thinking about Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island in the same way. It would be remiss if we didn't talk about some of the concerns right now with the plant that's being impacted by the Ukrainian war. So do you think it's a fair thing to say that 3 Mile Island things change, or maybe is it just a delayed reaction? Well, 3 Mile Island wouldn't have stopped us, but wait a second, 86 Chernobyl. Do we really want to be building these things?
Not at all.
Why do you think that is?
What we were talking about off podcast is that I think nuclear disasters are national, in that they are so heavily regulated. Each plant is regulated, and each nation has its own set of regulations. You mentioned that on what is it? Nuclear NES scale? What scale?
The INES scale, yeah.
INES scale. Chernobyl was a 7. And 3 Mile Island was a 5. On the list you're looking up right now, does it list other incidents that we know about? Because I'll tell you right now, yes, we know about a 7 that happened in the Soviet Union. How many others are on this list? Because this is one of the things that came out of it. They definitely hushed it up. And the only reason we know about Chernobyl is because the Swedish and the Western Europeans were detecting this radiation.
Right.
Lower level things 100% happened in the Soviet Union, and we did not hear about it. And I feel like, not to get overly technical, maybe this needs to be a video episode, because I'm about to give visuals. American reactors were built with the reactor core and the rods are inserted from the bottom. Soviets were built the other way, where the rods are lowered into the core. You know what that means? If the power spikes and if there is a problem in an American reactor, gravity takes over and the power rod falls out of the core. It stops generating power.
Right.
That is one of the things that caused Chernobyl, is when the engine, when the mechanism inserting and removing the power rod malfunctioned, gravity took over and the power rod fell into the reactor. If I am not a nuclear scientist, but if it is that easy to make their designs sound that dangerous, their designs were dangerous. Right. They had other accidents. And also just kind of thinking about, we've talked a lot about France. Let's talk about Japan as well. If there's a single country in the world that we might expect to be a little hesitant about anything with nuclear in front of it, it's Japan. They were also very big on nuclear energy because they looked at Chernobyl, they looked at 3 Mile Island, and they said, we have a different regulatory regime. We build our plants differently, we inspect them differently, and it wouldn't happen here.
Right.
So if you have the United States looking at something going wrong in the Soviet Union, I think it's very easy for the United States to explain away. We don't build things like that. We inspect them more. We have more safeguards.
Yeah. And the other interesting thing about this scale, didn't know this scale existed. So again, one of the reasons I like doing a podcast, we learn stuff. By the way, it's a logarithmic scale, Chris.
Okay.
1 to 7. So it's not just, a little bit, it's orders of magnitude more severe. And there are there's only been 4 accidents, as best I can tell here in history, that rated the scale of a 7.
Of a 7?
Of a 7.
A 7 is Chernobyl, correct?
A 7 is Chernobyl. There was I'm sorry, let me rephrase it. Fukushima and Chernobyl were both 7s.
Okay.
3 Mile Island was a 5.
Correct.
There was an event in Russia in 1957 that rated a 6.
Yep.
And then you go below that, you get down into, not that they're not important, but the 4s, 3s, 2s, and 1s, because this is logarithmic scale, are not nearly as dangerous. All of them are dangerous, or else they wouldn't be monitoring them, as the 5s, 6s, and 7s.
And sitting right there looking at the list, if you would like to share your screen, I might be able to read it. But do you know where that was? The 6 that you're talking about right now in 57?
It was, you should be able to see it on, well, maybe if I share the screen properly here, you'll be able to see it.
Mayak.
Yep.
Okay. Mayak was one of their research facilities so that's kind of them, like we were talking about earlier, that is them trying to figure out where, how to control this.
Right.
But okay, I looked into this kind of stuff. Nobody else has ever heard of this.
Yeah.
Because it was sealed off, it was in a closed facility, and it was worse than what we just talked about, shutting down American plant construction.
Right. Well, and the other interesting thing here, I hadn't seen this when we were doing the prep work before the podcast. There are events here in France that are on this chart that we happen to be looking at right now, but they're on the lower end of the severity spectrum. Mm-hmm. And, again, the thinking there is, okay, we learned from that and we will get better at it. Yes, we had this 1993 level 2 incident in France. We had there's an event here that's listed as a 4 in 1980, so about the same time as 3 Mile Island. That did not detour the French nuclear industry. They took the lessons from it. They learned, as you said, regulatory regimes, and
Mhm.
okay, they kept going. Such now that three-quarters of the electricity generated in that particular Western European country is nuclear.
Mhm. Mhm.
And it's been 30 years. It was 30 years almost in the United States between even thinking about licensing a new plant, just because of the one incident that was there. So it
Right.
definitely changed the trajectory.
Right.
Yeah. So any final lessons, any final thoughts from this, Chris?
Just to kind of think about getting really into what I used to do. We're thinking about these nuclear incidents. There's a town in Canada that doesn't exist anymore called Lac-Mégantic. And what happened is one of these trains, they call them bomb trains, coming out of North Dakota, malfunctioned and blew up and took out most of the town. There's no free lunches. The other thought I had, two more thoughts. One, if we went to a non-greenhouse fuel source, maybe we don't even have this topic because it's not above 100 degrees every day for the upcoming week for you.
You make an excellent point there, Chris, in the sense that it's part of the again, what struck me, what even caused me to suggest this when we were talking about a topic that you and I could do that wasn't sealing a topic that we knew the rest of our contributors wanted to be a part of. So
i.e. killing some president.
Yeah, exactly. Or still trying to prevent a world war that's impossible to prevent except in one unique instance. But your point is spot on there, Chris, because what the other major change that can happen if there's no 3 Mile Island is not just what's happened since then to date, because we know what the period is here, but I'm firmly convinced with them. We avoid politics a lot. We talk around it on the podcast for the reasons that we do, but there's no doubt that our future history over the next couple of decades is also going to be dominated by the impacts of what's going on with climate change, however you fall on the spectrum of how insignificant or severe you believe that is. It's already playing into our global politics. It's certainly playing into national politics here in the United States. It will continue to have an impact. And if we had just slowed that down as a result of a little bit more nuclear by one of the largest energy producers and consumers in the world in the United States, would that have a change on where we are and where we're going? The answer, I think, is yes. There's no doubt about it.
Here's the last thought. JR doesn't matter. Nobody cares who shot him. If you don't have the oil boom in northern Texas, okay? I am not talking about your very highly skilled refining capacity down in Texas. I am talking about a bunch of cowboys running around, sticking rods in the ground like Beverly Hillbilly style, North Texas.
You're talking about Yankee Texas. That's a different thing than real Texas, but there you go.
Dallas isn't a thing. Dallas, the TV show, not a thing.
It's less of a thing. Dallas would still be a thing, but but I do believe the path of when you were hitting upon earlier, this is very, very interesting to me. I do think the path of solar and wind in this country would have taken a very different route if nuclear were more there, because they've sort of picked up the slack of what would have been the nuclear component in our electricity generation stack. Literally, that's what they call it, the stack. Although what's different there and where this really comes into play is you can't make, for example, wind power very much of your base stack because it's not consistent.
And it's also with both solar and wind. I mentioned something earlier. I said it a little flippantly, but the thing you need to build a nuclear plant is a lot of water. The good thing is humans also need a lot of water.
Right.
So, for example, I'm not familiar with where the South Texas project is, but there's a plant right up the Hudson River from New York City. You could build nuclear plants if they're regular, and I know there's a great movie about that as like a nightmare scenario, but if it's controlled, well, you saw 3 Mile Island. It is visible from the state capital of Pennsylvania. Your nuclear plants can be built very close to your consumption.
Right.
Because your consumption follows people that needs just the water. That's all it needs. As opposed to, I just happen to know that one of the larger solar plants is built in the middle of the Mojave Desert.
Uh-huh. And there's in Texas, for example, and this is true in other parts of the U.S., but in Texas, the wind generation is very rural in terms of where it is. West Texas, just because of the visibility pollution, the large ugly wind turbines, kind of thing is actually become a thing here in the state of Texas. And you're right, it makes a difference being able to put your generation capacity near your consumption when you're talking about electricity. There's a big plus to being able to do that.
You lose electricity,
right,
if you have to transport it over a large area.
Yeah. And part of what then you do is then you shift some of those fuel sources to other, what's producing electricity out in Arizona where you might not be able to do that. Well, that's where you then shift the other capacity capabilities out there because you're able to move that stuff around. All right. I don't know if we solved anything, Chris, because I don't know if we ever solved anything, but I thought it was interesting just to sort of explore, what would it be like if 3 Mile Island were not in our vocabulary as a nation?
The other thing, I think this is a really interesting episode for us just because it's not a narrative. I think we touch here, we touch there. It's not a story behind all of it.
Oh, I agree. But because it's hard to figure out what that story would look like or what that story would be.
Or we could go down the road of talking about geopolitical instability because of a lack of the oil. But then we start getting off into just throwing stuff against the wall, which we've done sometimes, but
yeah, I agree. All right. Chris, good to visit with you both off podcast and on the air, so to speak. Good to see you. Appreciate you joining today. We appreciate our listeners for joining us here on A Fork in Time. We keep telling you we're getting back in the swing, and slowly but surely we are. Again, as we've often said here, we have these things called real lives that get in our way of this fun thing that we get to do. So stick with us. We'll be back with another episode soon. Chris, I am going to suggest to our listeners, possibly if they come along A Fork in Time, do you have any idea about what maybe they should do?
Take it.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more and provide feedback by visiting our website at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Connect to us on Facebook at facebook.com/A Fork in Time or follow us on Twitter at AFIT Podcast. If you want to support the show financially, visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/A Fork in Time. We hope you will join us next time.